Going to go ahead and get started. I'll continue to add people as they come in, but Matt is going to take it away.
Your mic's not on.
Is this better volume wise now? Okay. I can hear myself now. Okay, awesome. I think I had turned it down by accident when I meant to turn it up. All right. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and start the screen share now, and then we'll get going. I hope if I was actually at the start. All right. So good morning, everyone. My name is Matthew Greer, and I've been running archaeological research at Belle Grove since 2015. And a lot of this has been for my dissertation research at Syracuse University. And we're at a point now where the archaeological project, we are wrapping things up. I'm just about ready to finish my dissertation, and a lot of the other projects that we've been doing through the archaeology, we're tying things together, we're finishing up. So before we finish all that up, we wanted to come back this week and do a little bit of archaeology to wrap things up, to tie a bow on the fieldwork that we've been doing, and also to help prepare Belle Grove for future archaeological research. And what we're doing this week with that is we are doing two different remote sensing surveys. And what I want to talk to you all about this morning is sort of what we're doing with that work and what it'll tell us, hopefully. So for those of you who are not here in person, which I believe is most of you, and for those of you who have not been to Belle Grove before, Belle Grove is located in Virginia, in Frederick County, which is the northernmost county in the Shenandoah Valley region. And Belle Grove was a wheat and cattle plantation owned by the Height family from the 1780s to the 1850s. In addition to being the home of the Heights, the Heights enslaved 276 enslaved women and children and men during this time period. Only ever about 103 at the most at any one point in time, but it's still a lot of people that they enslaved. And my dissertation research and a lot of the work that we've been doing at Belle Grove recently has been trying to look at the lives of these women and men. And so Belle Grove has a long history of archaeological research. Archaeologists started doing work at Belle Grove in the 1970s. And most of the work in the 1970s, you can see this map on the left-hand side of the screen. These are areas of the landscape around the manor house at Belle Grove where they excavated in the 70s. And you can see here on the right side, we have these two foundations that you can see. In the 70s, they excavated a large smokehouse and also a large two-story building called Old Hall, which was the original house at Belle Grove. And in the 70s through the 90s, all of their work was focused on the manor house grounds itself. And it wasn't until sort of the mid-90s when archaeologists from James Madison University began to look beyond the manor house grounds. And they did this by doing a variety of surveys throughout the property. And one of the things that they found was a site across the street from the manor house. So if you've been to Belle Grove before, this site that we're talking about is right across the street from the visitor parking lot. In their work, they identified a possible enslaved quartering site or site where enslaved people would have lived. But unfortunately, there wasn't any money to do any research out there, and there wasn't a huge drive to look at that site. There were other sites that were more pressing at Belle Grove. So the site sort of lay dormant for a while until 2015. When I started doing my dissertation research, I knew I wanted to study the lives of women and men at Belle Grove, the enslaved women and men. And I was really interested in doing some work at this site because it seemed like a good, promising site to do this research. And so with this research, we started with a shovel test pit survey or an STP survey. And what this is we establish a grid on the landscape. And you can see all these dots on this map. They are spaced either 20 feet apart or 40 feet apart, depending on the close ones or the far ones. And we go out to every dot on this map on the landscape and dig a hole about 1 foot in diameter down through the ground. And then we put all that dirt through a screen and look for artifacts in it. And then we can map out the distribution of those artifacts throughout the area and see where sites are located or where buildings are located within sites. So what we ended up finding is that this quartering site was huge. It's about 1.5 acres. It's the shaded in area in the map here. And as far as we can tell, the site was built around 1800 and probably abandoned around 1850, or at least in the 1850s. And from what we can tell, this is probably the main quartering site for enslaved people at Belle Grove. This doesn't mean that everyone the Heights enslaved would have lived at this site. The Heights had essentially 4 plantations that they ran. So the enslaved community would have been divided out amongst these plantations. We're talking maybe at the most 40 people at Belle Grove itself. So maybe six to 8 houses, and we think that this site probably had most of those. There might be a few other people living elsewhere, but most people at Belle Grove were at this site. And because it's such a large site, we had to sort of narrow our focus down. Otherwise, I would never have finished up my research. So we focused most of our area, most of our excavations on this eastern edge of the site, this area that's in orange on the map right now. And we did 3 years of excavations over there. And the main thing that we ended up finding is the location of a log cabin that enslaved people lived in. And that's this orange star on the map. And this cabin was built around 1800 and burned down in the 1850s on an unfortunate house fire. But again, this is just scratching the surface of what's out there in this field. Based on the shovel test pits that we dug, we think we have more houses, at least 2 more houses and a blacksmith shop in the area in this next orange rectangle. And we also have good evidence of a barn and a, can you advance the next slide? Barn and a stable in this orange area here. But unfortunately, with the shovel test pits, it's a good way to quickly survey a large amount of area, but it's not super precise. It can tell you that there's a building in this rough area, but it can't tell you this is exactly where it is. So one thing that we really want to do as we're wrapping up our research is to see if we can figure out exactly where these buildings are located so that future researchers can just hop to that exact spot and excavate them. And now that we're also at the point where we're finishing up, it was also time to start thinking about how the research that we've been doing in the field quarter site, or the quarter site, fits in with the rest of the plantation landscape throughout Belle Grove. So we're ready at this point to start tying in how this site relates to the manor house, how this site relates to other buildings and other sites at Belle Grove. And the work that we're doing this week is helping us with both of those objectives. And the first survey that we're doing out here this week is a LiDAR survey. And we'll get to what this actually means in a second, but let's start by sort of the big picture. And one of the questions that we have is sort of where the road networks were at Belle Grove. We know there's multiple buildings throughout the plantation. So we're wondering, like, what road networks connected all of these buildings? And unfortunately, historic maps can give us a starting point for this, but they are not perfect. So the earliest map of Belle Grove that we have is this map on the left. And this dates to 1809. And Belle Grove is this house sort of in the center. It says I Height. And the only road that it shows coming through is this road coming right through the plantation. And today, this is Belle Grove Road. So if you are here in person, you drove up Belle Grove Road to get to the plantation today. But this is not a super detailed map. Unfortunately, in the South, throughout the 18th and early to mid 19th century, the maps of the landscapes that they drew were not really very good. They didn't care about actually noting where all the roads were or all the buildings. They mostly focused on sort of showing the homes of the wealthy elite in the area. And in fact, this map, if we were to zoom out, It is a map of the Northern Valley, and it only shows the homes of men who chose to pay money to be on this map and the major roads that connect their homes. And when the Civil War broke out in the 1860s, throughout the South, they realized all the existing maps were not good enough to sort of start planning maneuvers. So we get a bunch of maps being made in the 1860s to help plan military strategies. Because at Belle Grove, there was a lot of Civil War activity. There was the Battle of Cedar Creek here in 1864, and a lot of troop movement throughout the entirety of the war coming through this area. We have a lot of maps from the 1860s showing Belle Grove. And we have two of those here on the right-hand side of the screen. If we look at the top right, again, we can see this road cutting through the plantation. That's Belle Grove Road today. We can see a few more roads than we see in the earlier map. So this is a good starting point, but unfortunately, this dates to the 1860s. So this doesn't tell us anything about older roads that may have been used during the Height era at Belle Grove, but were no longer being used by the 1860s. So we want to get a much better understanding of the road networks of the plantation. We don't even know for sure what the shape of the driveway was around the manor house. So if you've been to Belle Grove, you might have noticed that the driveway today is a sort of teardrop shaped area in front of the manor house. We don't know if this was the historic driveway or if this is a 20th century driveway that got added onto the landscape. And the work that we're doing this week is going to help hopefully answer some of these questions. So we're doing a LiDAR survey, which stands for light detection and ranging. And what this is we have a very large drone that's flying up into the air about 60 meters up, about 190 feet. And it has a device that's just constantly shooting out lasers onto the ground. And it measures how long it takes for those laser beams to go down to the ground, bounce off, and come back to the device. And from this, it'll tell you how far down the ground surface is in this area. So there's a lot of different ways that you can use LiDAR data. But the way we're using it for is to make topographic contour maps. So this might be a review for some of you, but I want to make sure we're sort of all on the same page. So topographic maps or topo maps are maps that show elevation change. So you can see here, this is a topo map of Belle Grove. All of the little gray lines on this map are elevation changes. And for this map, every line is a 10-foot change in elevation. So if we look around the area here, in this area that is circled in orange, we have a lot of lines close together. This means that there's a lot of elevation change at a small area. So this is a hill. If we look at this area on the right, we can see that we have fewer lines and they're spaced out. This means that this is a pretty flat area. And this can be important for finding historic roads, especially old dirt roads, because dirt roads erode out really easily. And as people and animals and wagons move over these roads for years and decades, they will carve that road down into the ground, which means it essentially becomes a contour line on a map if you go down deep enough. So if we're making a contour map of the property, we can find these roads as sort of depressed linear areas on the landscape. But unfortunately, again, these topo maps that we have so far only have a sort of 10-foot elevation areas. And this sunken road right here is not 10 feet deep. So if our road, with the maps that we have, unless our roads are 10 feet deep, they are invisible on the maps that we have. So we have this really important issue that we're dealing with right now of spatial resolution. And this is something that most of you are probably familiar with when we're dealing with images and cameras, but I want to review this real quick. So how close together your pixels are or your points of data really heavily affect what you can see in images. So for instance, we have on the screen this really super pixelated image. And if you're just looking at this, you can tell this is a person. But like this is a fairly well-known painting, and you can probably not pick out what it is just based on this really heavily pixelated version. But if we have smaller pixels, if our data is closer together, then we can see that this is a painting by Frida Kahlo. And we can start seeing all these details that we miss when our pixels are further apart. And there is a lot of sort of free LiDAR data that we can go online right now and download. It's all government issued stuff. It's easy to use, really, if you have the right computer software. And we can get better topo maps using this data that we can get from the sort of existing topo maps. So if we look at this one here on the right, which is one that we made based on existing LiDAR data, and we can compare it to the sort of the existing topographic maps, we can see that the one on the right is far more detailed. And we can get a much better view of the landscape from this. But unfortunately, the data that we have only has one laser point for every 7 feet on the ground. So again, like we can say that this picture of Frida Kahlo is better than our really blocky one, but it's not as good as this one here. When we have this better version, we can see that her signature is in the top right. We can see that there's a hummingbird above her head to the top right that you can't really see before. We can see that she has a thorn necklace and drops of blood. These are details that we can start picking out if we get better, our points and pixels closer together. So what we're doing this week is we are flying a large drone throughout the property. And it has this laser device, this LiDAR device, and it's just shooting points down. And it is actually in the air as we speak. And we're hoping that this will get us 1 point for every 8 inches on the ground, which is infinitely better than our 1 point for every 7 feet. So we're hoping with this, we can really start picking out road networks on the plantation. And another thing that we're really hoping this can help us find are foundations. So this here is a small house site at Belle Grove that I did some work on last summer. And for this site, the foundations are just open on the ground surface. So we can see on the image on the right, that line of stones is a foundation. On the image on the left, we have that chimney base, which is sort of where the chimney would have been. Those piles of rocks are the pier bases for the building. And if we have a really high depth topographic map, we can look at all of these individual rocks and say, okay, there's a concentration of lifted up ground here. This might be a foundation. This is one way that we can go through and sort of hopefully find buildings on the landscape that we have missed before and get a much better understanding of where all the buildings at Belle Grove were. But this also brings us sort of to the downside of LiDAR. Again, with what we're doing, all we are doing is making a topographic map. This map can tell us that there's something interesting going on at this site here, but it can't tell us that this is definitely a foundation. So the work that we're doing now is sort of a starting point. It can tell us where areas of interest are, but we still need to go out there in person and say, okay, yes, this is a cabin with a foundation that we should put on our list of things to excavate. Similarly, if we have our road networks, it can be really hard with LiDAR data to tell when that road dates to. Because depending on how deeply entrenched that road is, a road from the 1700s and the 1800s looks the same as a road from the 1900s, looks the same as a road that the farmers created to get out to a field 4 years ago. So once we start identifying these roads, we then need to sit down with historic maps and see if these line up with anything, and talk to local farmers and people that grew up around Belle Grove and ask them if they have any memory of a road in these areas. And hopefully through that oral history and sort of archival images, we can start getting a better sense of what roads we find at Belle Grove might be height era. So that is the first set of research that we are doing. And the next thing that we are doing is we are running a ground penetrating radar survey around the property. And for this, I want to start with a review of the historic images we have of Belle Grove and what these can tell us and what they are missing. So again, that map that we looked at earlier is the earliest image that we have of Belle Grove, and it's just like a stock house. That the house design that they used in that map is the same one they used for a bunch of different houses on there. They didn't care about getting an accurate representation. And the earliest really good images we have of the property come from the 1860s. They come from the Civil War. And for instance, we have here on the screen a selection of sketches that were drawn of Belle Grove and the battle that was here. And all of these tend to have a few buildings in common. They all have the manor house, or almost all of them do, at least all the ones here. They usually have Old Hall, which again was the original manor house at Belle Grove. And this one down on the bottom right actually has 3 buildings that line up with cabins at Quartersite B. So we do have an archival image showing cabins at the site, which is really cool. But unfortunately, when you start looking at these images in a lot of detail, what we ended up seeing is that these images are not very accurate. If you wanted to sort of measure that distance between Old Hall and the manor house, it changes in every different sketch. So we can't really use it to find where that building was. Even the chimney placement on Old Hall was incorrect from what we know from other data. And this image that on the bottom that shows the quarter site, to actually get onto the landscape for where the angle of this picture would have had to have been taken, you can't actually see any of these things because it's down below a hill. So these are all conjecture. These tell us that these buildings existed on the landscape, but they don't tell us that much more about them, unfortunately. But again, we also have a lot of Civil War era maps, and these get a bit more detailed because they're showing more of the buildings around the area. So these here, I think, are probably the 2 best Civil War era maps that we have, and these are both drawn by Jed Hotchkiss, who was a cartographer for the Confederate States. And you can see on here that there's 2 areas of interest for what we're doing. The area in red is the location of 2 buildings out in the field that we've been working on. And the area in blue, closer up to the manor house, we can see this row of 3 outbuildings stretching out from the manor house. So this gives us an indication that there's buildings here that we can do some archaeology on. And it's not until, I believe, later in the 1860s that we start getting photographic evidence of Belle Grove. And this is the earliest known photograph of the property. And we can see here when we look at it, the 2 major buildings that we're looking at is the Belle Grove Manor House, and this other building is Old Hall, again, that earliest house at Belle Grove. And we also have this other building in between them that you can kind of see on the screen. Depending on sort of how you have your color setting on this image, you can see it a little bit easier. And this, we believe, is a standing stone building that is sort of in between Old Hall and the manor house today. So the next image of Belle Grove that we have comes from 1866. And this was taken by a pair of brothers who were just traveling up and down the valley, taking these really nice photographs. And luckily, they took one of Belle Grove. There we go. So there's a few things here in this image that I want to point out. So out in the field, we have the location of a large stable and a large barn. And we think these are these 2 buildings that Hotchkiss is showing on his map. Over towards the manor house, we have Old Hall again and the manor house again. And we also have this stone building in between them. And unfortunately, the quarter site is right behind that clump of trees there in the middle. This image is one that was shared with me a couple years ago, but the copy that we had available was a really low quality one. It was a bad scan that a library had done. And it took years to track down this. This is the original, a scan of the original. And we were really hoping we get this really awesome view of the quarter site circa 1866. And the library emailed me this picture and I got really excited. I opened it up and there's trees in the way. Because of course that would happen. Okay, so the next image we have dates to 1888. This comes from, I believe it's a U.S. Army reunion at Belle Grove. And again, we see the same two buildings. We see Belle Grove's Manor House. We see Old Hall. We see the stone building. The problem with all these images that I've shown you so far is they're all essentially showing the same angle. They're looking at the Manor House sort of dead on. And a lot of the area that the Hotchkiss map shows outbuildings is blocked by the Manor House. Unfortunately, we do have one image showing this area. And it is this image here, again, of Civil War veterans at Belle Grove. And the real area of interest is this right in here. Because if we look at it, we can see a couple different buildings from an angle we have not seen before. And this photo dates to around 1900. So if we can compare this to our Hotchkiss map that we've been using, we see that the large barn is still standing, but the stable is gone. This means that the stable would have had to have been torn down between 1866 and around 1900. We also have the Manor House again. Old Hall is missing. We do have the stone building there, which means Old Hall gets torn down between 1888 and about 1900. And we also have these buildings back in here, which we had not previously seen in any of the photos. And this suggests that there are more outbuildings sort of back behind this area. And then we actually have a image of a cabin at the quarter site, which is really cool because we have photographic evidence of one of the houses there. Now, unfortunately, this is the last historic image we have of height era outbuildings at Belle Grove. In the 18-teens and the 1820s, the Brumbach family owned Belle Grove, and they renovated the whole property. They took down a lot of the old dilapidated height era buildings and built new modern farm buildings so they could make a living working at Belle Grove. And we know from oral history, for instance, that they tore down this barn and this last standing cabin in the 1820s. 1920s, yes. Time is relative. And archaeological research is confirming some of this as well. So again, we can return to this image. We have excavations at Old Hall, which is his first building in this row of outbuildings that Hotchkiss shows. We have excavations at the smokehouse, which is either the first or second building in this row. We're not quite sure. We do have evidence of a building in between these, which could be that middle building that Hotchkiss shows, or he could be missing buildings. So there could be more in this row. We just don't know. We know he's missing other buildings on the landscapes. We just don't know what he's not drawing. And unfortunately, this is really all we know about outbuildings at Belle Grove. And there's a lot of sort of remaining questions about where outbuildings may have been, what their function may have been. And when we start looking at sort of the broad, and if we want to do future excavations at these, it's good to know where these buildings are located. If there's going to be any future construction at Belle Grove, it would be helpful to say, okay, there's a building here, avoid this area, or there's nothing in this area here, you can go ahead and put a utility line through. But also in terms of tying the landscape together, we are really interested in looking at sort of view sheds at the plantation. What could people see from different points on the landscape? And there's a standing question of what the Heights could have seen of the quarter site from their house. So essentially, are the Heights sort of maintaining a constant surveillance of enslaved people while they are at their homes? And was this being used to try to control enslaved people? And unfortunately, we have some sort of historic trees in the way that sort of affects this. But if these trees aren't there in this image, then you can see the quartering site today with where the present outbuildings are. And we're really interested to know where the historic outbuildings are, because that can affect what could be seen from these areas. So this is one way of really tying the plantation landscape together, is knowing where all these buildings are, because this informs us about what's going to be going on moving forward. And to answer this, we are sort of find these buildings. We are doing a ground penetrating radar survey of the property. So ground penetrating radar, or GPR, is a radar antenna. It kind of looks like a large car battery. And you have some sort of carriage that drags it across the land. And as this antenna is going out, it's shooting out pulses of radar waves. And these waves will go down and bounce off objects in the ground and return back to the radar antenna. And it's sending so many signals that, and they're really strong signals, that they can even go through stones and things like that. So we can really see anything down to the ground, in the ground, to about 7 feet of depth pretty well. We can look at different depths on the landscape. And the way this really works is if this signal bounces off something that's hard, like stones, like a foundation or tree roots, it's going to give you a really strong signal return that's coming back to the antenna. So we can say, okay, there's something in this part here that has a really strong, it's really reflective. There's something here. Or if you have an area where people have dug up the soil and put it back, that soil is going to be looser than the soil around it. So it's going to give you a weaker signal than the area around it. So we might be able to figure out where holes on the ground are as well. If somebody dug a pit and then filled it back in. So we're using this to try and figure out where the outbuildings at Belle Grove may have been. And for this, we are doing a big survey, sort of all these areas on this map here. We are hoping to get to, probably not going to get to all of them, unfortunately. But this will let us find where buildings are sort of around the manor house. And also you can see these blocks that we have out in the field. This should help us pinpoint the location of those buildings that we know are out there, but we don't have the exact location of. But there's one important caveat with GPR. When we're looking at it, bedrock and foundations can look the exact same. They're both stone. The antenna can't tell you, oh, these stones are artificially arranged necessarily, unless you see the logo. Here we have a rectangular foundation. And if you have been to the valley or been to Belle Grove, especially, you know that we have a lot of exposed bedrock popping up in the ground everywhere. And all of this exposed bedrock can look like a foundation in our data. So we're going to do a lot of processing after this week to go through and see what parts of our data might be just rocks and what might actually be foundations. So it'll take some time to process this, but hopefully once we're done, we will have a really good understanding of where different buildings were at Belle Grove, both for tying the landscape together and for sort of figuring out where to go next with Belle Grove archaeology. And I'd like to thank Belle Grove, especially Chris and Lace and Elizabeth, for setting up all of this. And I do especially want to thank Melissa Derrick and Guido Pesarozzi, who are down here from Syracuse University, helping me run all of this remote sensing this week. So that is the talk. So now I guess questions. I saw we had some come through on the chats.
They wanted to know, why is it important to know where the roads were? That's the one question we've seen.
So it's important to know where the roads were, because this helps us sort of tie the landscape together. This gives us a better sense of how the plantation functioned, how people moved through it and where they went. So does that answer your question?
Been so interesting.
Oh, that's good. Thank you.
Matt, would you comment on how easily detected a well or a water source?
So for those of you sort of on the internet, the question was, how easy would it be to detect a well with the GPR? It should be pretty easy, because a well shaft goes down really, really deep. So we would, and because with the LiDAR, we can, or sorry, the GPR, we can see, oh, we have a circular anomaly that's going all the way down. And that is what a well would look like. So we can say, okay, there's something here. Unfortunately, a well and a drainage pipe can look identical. So we think we found some drainage pipes that are sort of going straight down for the same reason. And we'll need to pick out the data to see if it's a well or if it's a drainage pipe. So I hope that answers that question. We don't know where any wells are around the manor house. And that's sort of a standing question, sort of if they had wells or if they relied on spring water being hauled up by enslaved people.
But Matt, did I hear that this enslaved quarters would have had stone foundation?
So the question was if the enslaved quarter would have had stone foundations. Unfortunately, they don't seem to. The cabin that we've excavated so far has no evidence of foundations. There's a lot of bedrock in that field, so they may just be putting the cabin up on bedrock for the corners. And it's possible that we haven't excavated the whole footprint of that building. So it's possible that there are corners, but there's no contiguous foundations around it. But it does have a large root cellar underneath it. It's about only 2 feet deep, but 7 by 9 feet wide and long. So this sort of thing is something we can pick up with the GPR. So we're hoping that if we do the GPR in this area and these other houses have root cellars, then we can find that and use that to locate the buildings.
Just curious, why do you call it the quarter site?
So the question was, why do we call it the quarter site? And I don't actually know what the origin of that is. That's what I was taught to call it.
So you have a question, what is the cost of LiDAR?
So LiDAR, the cost of LiDAR can really vary depending on who's doing it and the quality of it. So luckily, Syracuse University got a whole LiDAR set up. I think it costs around $50,000, but they're letting us use it for free this week. So our cost is travel money for people to come down here and food money for while they're here. So very reasonable. But if we wanted to sort of get our own setup, it would be tens of thousands of dollars. You can also contract with people who do it by flying airplanes over, but that tends to be more expensive as well. I know Montpelier Plantation in Orange County, Virginia did a LiDAR survey a couple of years ago, and I think it cost like $60,000 to the whole property.
Another LiDAR question. What is the limitation of LiDAR in this project?
Okay, so good question. The question is, what is the limitation of LiDAR? So our big, and I think the way I'm going to answer this will address this. And Dorothy, if I'm not addressing what you actually want to know, please let me know. The major limitation of LiDAR is how close together our laser points are. If they are further apart than we would like, this really keeps us from looking at the fine detail of the landscape that we want. So we have these two variables that we can control: how high up the drone is flying and how fast it's going. Because what you do is you pre-program the flight path, and then it's on autopilot as it goes through the plantation. And the faster it goes, the fewer points you can have, because it's shooting at the lasers at a constant speed. The higher up, the further dispersed the lasers points are going to be. But we also have very limited battery. So we're trying to sort of balance these three factors out. And so those are two things: sort of how close your points are together. And also with this data, once you fly through the woods, we can eliminate any point that's from a tree. But this is going to mean less points for us to work with in wooded areas because there's all the trees in the way. So we're going to have to see how much data we actually get that's usable from the woods because of all the trees in the way. Dorothy, does that answer your question? Okay, awesome.
Yes.
Thank you.
So I have two questions. I'm going to ask them out of order here. Are there any public sources for this information like USGS?
Yes. So topographic maps, you can get PDFs of them for free. The LiDAR data sets are for free. They used to be on a USGS data website. They've now moved to a new one. I don't know the name of that website. But these are all free to get. But unfortunately, the software for processing them tend not to be free. So we're using ArcGIS for a lot of this. And a license for that, I think it's down to like $100 for a small personal use license for a year right now. We have access to all this through different universities right now, but if you were going to do this on your own, there would be a cost in terms of getting the software and then learning how to use it. So it's free to use, might cost some money free to get, might cost some money to use.
Got another one here. I'm trying to figure out how to tie them together. It says, I have read several detailed archaeological reports on excavation of Drayton Hall. Is there anywhere the public can read what has been discovered at Belle Grove currently?
So the question is there anywhere the public can read what has been discovered at Belle Grove at the moment? Not quite yet. We do have a report from the first field season that's out, but that's all out of date right now. There will be. We've just had a backlog. There's some articles out, but they are technically behind paywalls right now. But if you have JSTOR access or something through a university, you can get access to them. Or if you contact Kristen, you might be able to look at some of these as well, or myself. But these things we're going to be having reports that are coming out. I just need time to put all these together. And my dissertation will also be publicly available. So that'll have most of this information as well. So it's a work in process, unfortunately.
Okay, we have another one. This is one I've been very interested for you to answer. How many artifacts have you found, and can they be viewed?
So since 2015, we have found 61,249 artifacts. Most of those are from the quartering site. Some of those are from some work we've done elsewhere. At the moment, those are not available for being viewed. They will be shortly, though. We are in the process of putting together a exhibit in the Manor House that will have a lot of the really nice artifacts on display. We're going to have a study collection so you can see hundreds of artifacts. And if you do have a research interest in Belle Grove as well, all the artifacts are stored at Belle Grove, so you can come look at them for that as well.
Question, lots of thank yous. People are excited to come visit.
Definitely please come visit if you
Yeah,
can.
they're looking forward to coming and seeing everything. Excited to read your dissertation. And then Kristen posted a preliminary report post. Enslaved archaeology.
Actually, I have some preliminary. I'm going to put up a link. That's mostly conference papers at the moment. But we have, I think, one of the articles. Yeah, there's only a few conference papers here, but they can be found at this website. And we will be working to make these put them in a central repository so they're easy for the public to find and look at.
Matthew, have you found any evidence of Indians on the property?
So the question is, we have evidence of Native Americans. Yes. So there, near a few miles from here, there was a large Native American palisaded village site that dates to probably, if I remember correctly, 1400 to 1600. And from that site, Native Americans were moving through the landscape, doing various things, getting food and rocks and things they needed. And at the quarter site, we do have evidence that they were going to that area, possibly using it as a hunting stand and also using it as a location for making stone axes. So we know there's a lot of Native American stuff in the area. I'm hoping that at some point somebody can sit down and start tying all that together, because it's been looked at individually, but we don't have a good sense of pulling everything from the park area together.
I know that LiDAR and GPR are not necessarily new technologies, but is their use for archaeological purposes like this pretty common, or is it early on? And the point of the question is, do you have an established body of best practices to leverage to understand what you're getting, or is your research in effect establishing those best practices for other archaeologists?
So for those of you out in the internet, the question was, since the LiDAR and GPR, are they established archaeological practices at this point in time, or sort of are we breaking new ground with these? These are pretty well established. GPR has been used for a long time. They're constantly getting better. And the GPR that we have was cutting edge a couple of years ago when they bought it, but I'm pretty sure the new devices they have now are even better. So for the GPR, it's not very cutting edge. It's just sort of, it's very, very common nowadays. And the LiDAR is a bit newer, especially the drone-based LiDAR is newer. The plane-based stuff they've been using for a long time. But the drone-based LiDAR is sort of established enough that we're drawing on other people's methods rather than establishing our own.
Teresa loved your presentation. She's got
Oh.
another question.
Oh, thank you.
She wants to know, is there any evidence of the slave cemetery, the slave burial ground, that was located on the map?
Yes. So the question was, is there evidence of the enslaved burial ground? And we do have some possible headstones out there, and they did some GPR out there in 2016, I think it was. And they found some possible grave shafts out there. And that's one of those questions. Kristen can speak to this more. But there's been some work out there. We know there's graves. We just can't prove that those are enslaved people because GPR can't really tell you that. It just tells you that there's a grave-like feature right here. We're actually hoping to go over some of that area this week if we have time, because then GPR technology is always getting better, and what we have, I think, is better than what they had a couple of years ago. So we might be able to get a bit new information on that this week. Does that answer your question?
We have another question about the LiDAR. Does the LiDAR products include vegetation analysis to see if subterranean changes impact the plant growth on the surface?
Very good question. So can LiDAR tell us anything about vegetation? Not very well. Unfortunately, LiDAR is not great for this. When we process the data, a lot of times we just say anything above the ground surface, get rid of it. But what we can really do is use multispectral satellite imagery for this. And Erica Moses, my research partner, who will be here, she can't be here this week because she has a full-time job she has to do. That's one of her specialties. So her master's thesis in the UK was looking at this multispectral satellite imagery, because I'm sure most people are familiar with crop marks. We can go up in the air and different types of archaeological features will affect how crops grow. So if you have a road that's going to be like stones, crops won't grow very well on top of that because the root network is going to be truncated. Or if you have a trash pit, all the rich organic material really let that corn or whatever does grow really well. And this multispectral stuff lets her sort of look at this at using near infrared light, because different plants will reflect near infrared light better if they're really healthy, and they won't reflect it as well if they're not as healthy. So again, if they're over top of the stone foundation, they're not going to be as healthy, so they won't reflect as much light. If they're in a nice, rich trash dump, they'll be really happy and reflect a lot of light. So we've done some work with this initially. Unfortunately, the data that she had was from a free government satellite, and it wasn't at a good enough resolution or a good enough time of year for what we wanted to do with it. If you wanted to look at like large fields of corn to see how it's growing, this data works fine. But we were co-opting this agricultural data for archaeology, and it didn't work as well. You can get those multispectral cameras though for a drone. So we're trying to get a drone flight out here at the right time of year so we can look at that as well. And that should be able to tell us about archaeological features that we can't necessarily see on the landscape. I hope that answers your question. I didn't ramble too much.
Another LiDAR and GPR question: can they detect underground water?
LiDAR cannot. LiDAR does not work well with water. It affects the laser and how it bounces off. And LiDAR also can't get anything under the ground. It's limited by the ground surface because that's the reflective surface for the laser. The GPR can be used for groundwater. I know they do work on like coastal areas to like measure where the groundwater is using GPR. So we haven't hit any groundwater in the little bit of work that we've done so far, but that is something that we could use it for.
Once the surveys are complete, how long does it take you to process the data to determine any conclusive findings?
That is a complex question. So we do a little bit of processing. We've done the GPR for 2 days now. We do a little bit of processing at night just to get a rough view of sort of what we're dealing with. But it'll take some more time to actually sit down and do a really good processing of it. And we're all limited by who has time to work on that and when they have time to work on that. So if we had a dedicated person who could just sit down and do nothing but that, we could probably get it all processed within a week. Since we don't have somebody who can sit down and dedicate a whole week to that, it'll probably take a little bit of time.
Questions on here?
Are there any more questions that anybody has? You can type them in the chat. We have a few more minutes if you'd like to do.
Can you just say a brief bit about it, the extent to which Civil War activities have appeared in your research, physically, on the ground?
So we had a question about there's evidence of Civil War activity that we're getting. We didn't get a ton up at this area that we were excavating, mostly because that house burned down before the war. We did get a nice Civil War bullet sitting right on top of our demolition, our burn debris. So it was a nice indication that like the house was burned down. This bullet's just laying on top. We did some metal detecting around the area as well. We did find a little bit of evidence, not a ton. But it does, from what we know from historic documents as well, that field wasn't a heavy fighting area. The U.S. Army was mostly retreating through that pretty quickly, so there wasn't a lot of firing lines and stuff being dropped. Elsewhere on the property, there's a lot of stuff. We just don't have a lot sort of where exactly we're working.
We did have another one pop up. It says, what about GPR detecting the sewer that may have been placed prior to one being placed in the 20th century?
We should be able to pick that up. As long as they didn't completely rip that new one out when they, or the old one out when they put the new one in, you should be able to see it. Even if they ripped it out, that should be a huge area of disturbance that the GPR can tell you something's going on here. So we should be able to find that. I hope that answers the question there.
And what you've already addressed, but she may have missed it. Have you found cemetery or burial ground?
So we have not found that in our research out at the field, but there is a enslaved burial ground elsewhere at Belle Grove that was sort of known about. And they did a little bit of ground penetrating radar work out there a few years ago. And we're pretty sure that it's a burial ground. We just can't prove for a fact that was where enslaved people were buried.
And Teresa with another great question. Have there been any surprises you have found in your research?
Ooh. Yes. How integrated enslaved people were into every aspect of life in the Shenandoah Valley was really surprising. The valley, if anyone is from the area, knows the area, the valley had a really large local ceramic industry. There's a lot of pots being made in the area, and just seeing that enslaved people were heavy consumers of these ceramics, and they were using them to store food that helped them sort of survive the winter because they weren't given enough food to survive. So they had to store food on their own to be able to eat it through the winter. And we're seeing a lot of this evidence for this. And they're having a fairly sizable economic impact on this industry by buying all of these ceramics. Just seeing all of these connections between enslaved people and sort of every aspect of life in the valley has been really surprising.
Anybody here have any more questions?
Just waiting for a response from Kristen.
No.
Sure. Well, if that's all that we have for questions, I think we got all of them.
Kristen,
Did
did
you-
you give any final remarks here?
Were you asking if I have any closing remarks?
Yeah, I didn't know if you wanted to conclude or anything.
Yeah, I
like
do.
that.
I did see, was there a question that was asked about the benefits of GPR in sandy soil? Did you ask that one?
Oh, I didn't see that one. Okay.
Or, I mean, are there circumstances with GPR is not helpful? Has that been covered?
Any circumstances where GPR is not helpful in sandy soil?
Yes, there are certain soil types that are really good for GPR and some that are really not good. And we're sort of in a middle area here. And I can't remember if sandier soil or clayer soil works better, but the soil really does impact it because it affects how that radar pulse can travel through it and bounce back through. None of these things are my specialty. So I'm sort of repeating what other people have told me. So I'm not quite sure about that.
Did I miss the answer to the question about detecting a sewer that may have been put in the early 18th or 17th century? Can a GPR find that?
She's asking about the sewer question that we answered.
The GPR should be able to find that. Depending on soil conditions, depending on how exactly, if that old sewer was ripped out, that might impact it, but it should be able to find it.
Okay, thank you.
So this is Kristen Lays, and I'm Executive Director at Belle Grove. I just want to thank Matt and his team for coming on site this week to do this innovative work and for him taking time out of that to share some of his research with you all. Looks like we've had a lot of great interest and questions about people who might be wanting to utilize this technology in their own projects. So we will send out the recording soon after the call, but we can also send out links to additional information so that people have a good working knowledge of all this technology. But Matt's been a terrific research partner for over 5 years, and we love working with him. We love learning from him. So thank you all for joining us today, and hope you have a great rest of the afternoon.
And thank you all for coming.